Welcome. Thanks so much for coming. I'm Travis Webster from Virginia Tech University. I'm here with my friend and colleague, Jonathan Rylander from Wisconsin-Eau. I have uploaded our notes and transcripts, also these slides, and also a recent article that informs this presentation today. It should be linked to the in the portal to this pres, so if you want to follow along with us. Today, so our presentation is embracing the always already toward queer assemblages for WAC admin. Today we'll define queer, discuss via Sarah Ahmed our arrivals to this project. We'll frame our work in critical and queer theory and then offer three larger kind of takeaway claims about queer WAC. In terms of just right out of the gate, a queer definition, we look to Jackie Rhodes and Jonathan Alexander's piece from the Queer Archives. So they define queer then as a self-conscious and critical engagement with normative discourses of sexuality in the public sphere that exposes their naturalization and torques them to create different or counter discourses, giving voice and agency to multiple and complex sexual experiences. So you might be thinking, what does that have to do with WAC? So we will kind of unpack that starting with our arrivals. So I'll hand it over to John for a bit.
Okay. So thank you, Trav. Sarah Ahmed reminds queer theorists that how we arrive at something matters. Listening to how this or that arrives enables us to better understand the context, just and unjust, from which our students and our colleagues meet us. At UW-Eau Claire, I direct a Center for Writing Excellence, one that articulates a broader mission, assisting not only students, but faculty through workshops, retreats, and other programming about the teaching of writing. Alongside these duties, I serve as a core faculty member, teaching first-year writing, writing center theories, and queer rhetoric courses. In day-to-day labors, I consult with cross-curricular faculty about writing in their courses. I approve writing-enriched syllabi across the curriculum. Together, Trav and I, we run sites. Together, we lead in our different avenues and different locations. We lead and work alongside staff. We offer faculty workshops for pedagogy and support. We have both prompted faculty fellows initiatives focused on helping faculty engage rhetoric and composition scholarship and its implications for fellows writing courses. We send countless emails. We interface with the top-down nature of academia, despite our best efforts to push against these dynamics when appropriate. Yet we also understand the idea of queer erasure in its many forms, from how we administer our WAC sites, however unintentionally and complicit in the often top-down, transactional, and oppressive nature of academic administration, to how we exist on our campuses as queer people doing WAC work, and to the ways WAC research and of the past and the present misses queer conversations in the first place. In this vein, as an administrator, I recognize that normal and stable working conditions matter, and they do. When I show up in the morning, for example, to my writing center, I want to see that place organized and in a full schedule, and students and faculty eager and at work with one another. In my work with faculty, I similarly like to offer regular office hours. I want to develop sound and pedagogically useful resources and best practices for faculty so that they can incorporate writing into their classrooms and their pedagogies in more effective ways. Yet despite these expectations for normality, if not sustainability, I cannot help but feel a personal conflict in the absence of my queer scholarly identity within my WAC work. We both do. For example, I am seen by some faculty at my institution, I believe, as the WAC consultant, one who may not even be understood as a faculty member to begin with. My queerness, further, is silent in such professional dynamics, or it most often is. And I expect some faculty with whom I interact to know little about my research areas, queer rhetorics and histories. It is not as though I'm not out at work, I am. The administrative tension lies in a rhetoric and writing subdiscipline, writing across the curriculum in our case here, that perhaps does not engage outwardly and explicitly with queer issues that arise in other subdisciplines, even including writing program administration or writing centers. Such exclusions from current writing across the curriculum research may trickle to our sites, our campuses, our work with students and faculty. So in seeking to meditate this tension, I have early in my administrative tenure sought out WAC research that could speak to any of these dynamics or these issues, whether queer orientations to WAC or intersections among queer identity, queer studies, and WAC administration. Ultimately, I came up short. We both did.
Okay, and in kind of moving forward into Donna LaCourte's article about WAC as a critical pedagogy, LaCourte laments, like we do, how cultural studies-based approaches manifest in her classes, yet fail to show up in her work with faculty. Such a failure, she says, has much to do with an unnecessary separation of epistemological and ideological concerns in WAC models. The separation that also produces and reproduces pragmatic efforts that push students and faculty alike to merely adhere to the conventions of disciplinary norms. Rejecting such separation, LaCourte outlines a critical WAC model, somewhat outlined here in the questions in this slide, one that welcomes students and faculty to critique the disciplinary norms in which they learn to think and write, and that values, quote, the cultural experiences of our increasingly diverse classroom. It values that our increasingly diverse classrooms offer, To extend upon LaCourte's claim, we reflect on conflicts between the normative parameters of our work, a number of things that John brought up a bit ago, and our queer capacities for labor often uninvoked. We cannot help but feel conflict in the absence of queer scholarly expertise within our WAC work. We trace this conflict to our own local administrative positions and to how WAC research of past and present has not taken up discussions about queer theories in WAC landscapes, queer bodies as well. In this sense, we believe a queer WAC conversation is a necessary first step. I'm going to jump to the next slide with John. John will take us through queer and critical lenses.
So as Trav mentioned at the beginning of our talk today, we frame our definition of queer, and I think it's important to repeat this here, alongside Jonathan Alexander and Jackie Rhodes' queer definitions rhetoric, or a self-conscious and critical engagement with normative discourses of sexuality in the public sphere that exposes their naturalization and torques them to create different or counter discourses, giving voice and agency to multiple and complex sexual experiences. This is the idea of queer. This is how queer operates as a verb. Yet, as these researchers and others we have encountered note, queerness may not always entail or involve bodies and discourses of sexuality. In this regard, a need for a queer lens for WAC administration and praxis at first may seem like theory for theory's sake. Perhaps the dearth of research on intersections among queer theories and WAC is because the two are reluctant bedfellows. On the one hand, both fields of study operate as massive entities in and of themselves that appear quite distinct. Unpacking the politics of WAC alone demands a deeper conversation of literacy across the curriculum, as Victor Villanueva and others' work has suggested, as well as the assumption that writing is always a political act. Further, the field of queer theory remains laden with increasingly divergent views of what queer theory means in the present. Michael Warner, for example, questions if we are post-queer theory, and he's not alone, while others have begun to call out an assimilationist momentum. And by that, we mean that the term queer is losing its critical edge and even fostering, if inadvertently, racist logics. As queer administrators of both writing across the curriculum programs and writing centers, we come to this presentation and to our talk with you today from the vantage point that WAC work is under-theorized as a queer area of study. We've said that, we stand by that. While Alexander and David Wallace suggested queer turn in composition studies, other scholars, such as Karen Coppelson, Will Banks, question whether the field took such a turn at all, given that many queer conversations remain stagnant, if not unexamined, especially in relationship to writing studies administration and its queer affordances. Still, little to no WAC scholarship engages with queer orientations to work in theory. At a deeper level, Trav and I question, along with scholars such as Jasper Puar, what the term queer gets attached to at present, within and beyond our control. What we mean here is that we find it dangerous to limit the purview of queer theory and activism to lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and queer or LGBTQ bodies. We acknowledge queer theory's roots in gay and lesbian studies and early street activism. Indeed, we recognize that just a couple summers ago in 2019 seems like a blur to from now. We mark the 50th anniversary of the Stonewall riots. Nevertheless, we are simultaneously disturbed by our current world in which marginalized bodies, especially bodies of color, continue to endure heinous acts of growing nationalist and white supremacist momentum gaining tread in this country. For us, these atrocities are queer matters that students are writing about across the curriculum. So to begin to address these matters, we articulate 3 claims that might help us as a field better understand WAC work not only as political, but also as responsible for marginalized student bodies and larger campus forces, wrapped within larger networks of unstable forces, such as racism and nationalism. In doing so, we hope to present WAC not as something that necessarily needs queering. And I want to repeat that. We hope to present WAC work not necessarily as something that needs to be queered. Instead, we understand WAC as queer in its present form, as always already queer, through its fleeting nature and its ties to larger and increasingly unstable institutional and social forces. As a lens, therefore, that can afford WAC in rhetoric and writing research practitioners distinct possibilities for the future.
Thanks, John. And we'll move on to 3 claims, one of which distinctly is situated in what some of the things that John just said. So we'll start with the idea that WAC work is always already queer. Again, not something that necessarily needs queer theory, but that exists in its present form queerly. So I'll take you through a couple of ideas here. So the word queer describes an adjective for a state of being that's divergent from a norm. When connected to WAC, such a claim stems from the institutional fluidity of WAC itself, which is often simultaneously a pedagogical orientation, a university site, and often an interdepartmental or cross-curricular initiative, which is to say that naming WAC, even at one university, is often a queer naming practice. Depending on any number of orientations at particular institutions, WAC may be an office, maybe an initiative, maybe a partnership with a writing center. Whether an office or an initiative, it may be formed or budding, it may be thriving, sustained, and funded. It may be struggling and unsupported. It may be a set of writing-enriched courses, it may be linked to the job of one director with faculty or staff status, or a group of faculty members and staff members, or even a university board. WAC is not static, but instead very fluid. It's often not one site, not one place, and not one person, nor simply one pedagogy or framework. In this sense, WAC initiatives are often perceived as outliers, oddities, and quote, weird kids. A WAC initiative itself often represents the pejorative definition of the word queer, read odd, in that WAC is occasionally also threatening to institutional cultures. Such realities may impact their perceived, quote, failures, to cite Cox's recent book on sustainability, in that WAC's foundation in transdisciplinarity is often its own institutional oddity, despite lip service to cross-disciplinary work in the push to counter institutional silos. In her work on writing studies admin in 21st century universities, Rebecca Hallman-Martini calls writing centers disruptive innovations, in that such sites depart from historic and ideological, pedagogical relationships and models that are typical of university support, such as teacher-student relationship or pedagogy, event, and classroom site. Writing centers are this kind of oddity. And while Hallman uses the word disruptive to name writing center work, such a term may be understood as its own disruptive innovation for WAC and writing centers, in that they too depart from best practice models. If we take Alexander and Rhodes's definition that surfaced in this presentation, Rec Comp practitioner scholars benefit from applying these queer themes to WAC work's place in institutions of higher ed, which is to say that the work of WAC seeks to shift normative institutional writing cultures that are often naturalized. Going on, cultural narratives of writing are not merely external to a university, but pervade institutions themselves, often through our curriculum. Engaging this queer vantage point, WAC missions may also counter public narratives about writing, thinking about some of the work of Linda Adler-Kasner when I evoke that term. So public narratives of writing that are available to and operationalized by colleagues across the curriculum, shifting how writing functions, how it's discussed at the university site in the first place. In this sense, WAC is queer in its mission to make cultural systemic changes which better respond to students' lived experiences and which better represent 21st century writing studies grounded in justice, inclusion, and equity. Put differently, progressive WAC approaches that avoid the administrative colonization of institutions. So this idea that WAC always sort of knows best, or our local Rec Comp folks always know what's best for a campus writing culture. Instead seeks collaboration and coalition building to suit cultures of writing for students and university stakeholders, which we consider to be, again, getting back to that idea of this sort of always alreadiness of queerness, of a queer orientation to WAC. Okay, so that's some of our foundation. In claim 2, we argue that listening for queer orientations, bodies, and possibilities may better help us understand our WAC work. So I'll kind of move through this as well. So claim 1 argues that WAC work is itself queer. And we point to a queer chasm in WAC research, and especially a specific kind of dire need to listen for queer bodies, theories, and orientations in our WAC work. From here, we look to Jackie Jones-Royster and Gisek Hirsch for guidance. In their Feminist Rhetorical Practices book, they pose the idea of a critical imagination that calls researchers to, quote, look beyond typically anointed assumptions in the field in anticipation of the possibility of seeing something not previously noticed or considered. The researchers point to women and women of color, their spaces, their artifacts, and their rhetorical practices lost or erased from current disciplinary methods and practices. Signaling strategic contemplation from critical imagination, they suggest an outward journey of fieldwork and analysis, giving careful attention to, quote, specific practices as they exhibit rhetorical effects, and call for inquiry into practices unexamined because of perceived disciplinary boundaries. For our project's purpose, such a practice and its capacity for further disciplinary listening is WAC work. While Royster and Kirsch focus their argument again on women of color and women, we see a space also, an intersectional space to think about queer orientations, theories, and people, and seek to listen carefully for chasms and to find spaces for queer disciplinary examination in this context. Employing such a imaginative, using their word, imaginative critical consciousness surfaces in Sandra Tarabokia's Reframing the Relational, which is an empirical examination of how comp and cross-disciplinary specialists speak with each other about writing and its pedagogies when working together on cross-curricular literacy work, which for our purposes is often read as WAC work. She's talking about WAC work and framing it as what she calls CCL. She closes her rich study with calls for further examination into participant identity intersections in WAC. In complicating her own data set, she tells us that a project participant, quote, identified as Latina and bisexual, raising questions about how difference based on race, ethnicity, sexual orientation might come to bear on cross-disciplinary conversations about teaching writing. She asks, what are the communicative implications of differences such as native language, nationality, and sexuality? We argue that her question itself speaks to queer chasms of body and theory, a route uncharted, despite this critical piece that this fantastic book she has. Similarly, the award-winning Meaningful Writing Project traces student agency, engagement, and transfer across undergrad students 4 years in higher ed. Ediche Geller and Lerner examined student bodies across 3 institutions over a longitudinal project. As John and I think about queer WAC uncovering, we notice one student participant in the MWP, quote, truly cared about the content of their paper, and links that back to the student working through a set of lived experiences and networks, and is connected to getting support from the student's friends who's gay. And we don't intend to cherry pick the one time that the researchers note the word gay in their book. Instead, we're looking to a critical imagination to what, despite is a beautiful award-winning project, is left unsaid or examined. So we kind of ask what queer bodies, orientations, and theories may be under the surface, especially of person-based empirical WAC research of recent research or recent studies. We note specific attention to what might complexly complicate already rich WAC work, teaching us about what's present, absent, and possible in the discipline and within our WAC programs and our own institutions. I'm going to go ahead and move to John because we're about 25 after. So I think we can move straight into claim 3.
Okay. So here we offer the theory of queer assemblage as articulated in the work of Jasper Puar as a methodology we find useful in listening for and perceiving queer bodies, orientations, and possibilities in the here and now. In her pivotal terrorist assemblages, Homonationalism in Queer Times, Puar challenges queer theory's tendency to posit queerness solely as human interaction, or human action, I'm sorry, as human action and performance. She also questions why queerness has come to signify only a limited action, that being transgression. For Puar, this configuration of queerness as transgression proves dangerous, especially when accounting for political and violent contexts, such as the abuse of orientalized others through anti-terrorism, detention, and deportation in a post-9/11 world, which she analyzes through a queer assemblage lens. Why does she do that? For Puar, transgressive queer movements, read only as activist and progressive, misses the reality that queerness often parallels and intersects, to use her words, with that of multiculturalism, the ascendancy of whiteness, and may collude with or collapse into liberationist paradigms, as she says. For example, Queer moves of resistance, such as those that focus only on activist efforts occurring in cosmopolitan cities such as New York City or San Francisco, perpetuate class divides and narrow conceptions of diversity typical of multiculturalism. In this sense, Puar pushes us to reorient our thinking about activist moves, to view them as not automatically transgressive, and often as complicit with racial, class, gender, and citizenship norms. This notion of queer assemblage builds from Gilles Deleuze and Felix Guattari's scholarship, both of whom worked together to develop ideas about assemblage, or to use the more appropriate French term for their work, agencement, a term that Puar writes means design, layout, organization, arrangement, and relations. The focus being not on content, but on relations or patterns, to use her words. For instance, Puar explains how the notion of queer-friendly countries is taken up or becomes desirable through numerous relations. That is the convergence, as she writes, of people, political campaigns, neoliberal agendas, geopolitical forces, capitalist enterprises, biopolitical state practices of population control, affective investments in discourses of freedom, liberation, and rights, as well as media portrayals and various media or technologies themselves. Queer assemblage then is a process, an unfolding or assembling together, in at times dangerous ways. In Intersecting Realities, an article titled Intersecting Realities, Queer Assemblage as Rhetorical Methodology, which I wrote with Jason Palmeri, we apply Puar's theory of rhetoric and writing studies to rhetoric and writing studies, arguing that understanding queerness, not as identity, but rather as an assemblage of sensations, affects, and forces, could prove useful for writing studies in rhetoric and writing studies as a field. Here, Trav and I want to suggest that such a methodology might prove useful for reorienting our approach to WAC work more broadly, as we've begun to suggest. We want to be clear that we are not speaking to the same types of international contexts that Jasper Puar does. Still, where she has used the idea of queer assemblage, specifically homo-nationalism, to critique the notion of fictional progressive coherence of gay rights, applying queer assemblage as a methodology for writing studies administration, and WAC work specifically here, might similarly enable us to reveal easy, perhaps even fictional, characterizations of diversity on college campuses, as well as how students and faculty respond to complex embodied differences, including those related to national and international differences. It could even apply to how we administer writing across the curriculum programs. And with that, I will pass it off.
Thanks, John. So in thinking of contextualizing this in a couple of stories that are from my previous institution, actually 2 institutions ago for me, we wanted to kind of think about a lot of this conversation is like, it's theoretical. Let's put some sort of pragmatic storytelling around some of it. So going off of what John said and in citing Puar, WAC programs find themselves hooked into an array of forces, including evolving curricular developments in first-year writing, WAC efforts, digital technology, but also to the complex embodied experiences of students and university stakeholders, and also larger kind of forces such as neoliberalism. Several years ago, while at another university, I housed a course-embedded tutors WAC program out of my writing center. In facilitating the relationship between a course-embedded tutor, who is an international student of biotech and cybersecurity, and a faculty partner, I experienced a somewhat trying meeting. As protocol during the semester, prior to working together, I tended to set up a meet and greet for the tutor and the faculty partner. Under normal operations, meetings were for discussion of partnership philosophies and also for document sharing and relationship building. This particular introduction was a bit awkward at best, if not somewhat jarring and codedly racist and kind of under the guise of white privilege and a lot of sort of politeness. During the first few minutes of the meeting, the tutor disclosed that she was an Indian international student working toward her grad degree. Relatively unprompted, the faculty partner, a white woman who's lived her entire life in the US, began inquiring into the student's immigration path, explaining that she too was an immigrant, quote, because she had, quote, immigrated from one part of the US to another part of it. Despite the clear lack of awareness of privilege a lifelong American native has in making such a statement to an international immigrant, the meeting did end okay, but the partnership did fall through eventually, and I'd often wondered if it in some way linked back to that conversation. Unpacking this anecdote through a queer assemblage lens entails a closer look at the forces that led me to feel jarred. For Puar, affects, which she's defined as the body's intensification upon itself, operate as an important force in and of themselves. And that's from that's also a quotation from I would rather be a cyborg, which is Haraway. Sorry about that. Some random quotes in there that I hadn't contextualized for myself. For her, we need to pay close attention. So for Puar, we need to pay closer attention to how our bodies react in this or that situation. Going back to that idea of arrival. So this situation, that situation, attuning not only to what is said, for example, the faculty partner straight up asking about a student's immigration path, but also the larger ecological forces, human and non-human, that filter into, through, against, and between bodies, causing us to feel certain things. To more precisely demonstrate what we mean here, let's take another force at play, neoliberalism. In her work on branding as neoliberal assemblage, Jen Wingard, a Rhet Comp author, who also draws from Puar's work, illuminates how neoliberal rhetorics continue to turn immigrant bodies into brands, quote, into brands that serve as cautionary tales of what to avoid, whom to fear, and who is outside the norms of citizenship, end quote. Such branding in turn functions against and more clearly defines American values tied not only to the individual and human identities, but deeper histories and discourses of racism, colonialism, misogyny, homophobia, and sexism. Indeed, neoliberalism flattens these discourses in order to simplify not only who rightly belongs in the US, but also, we argue, who belongs on our campuses and in our writing programs, and by extension, our writing centers and WAC programs. And in retrospect, we're less than surprised by the faculty members' probing questions. We see them as yet another sign through which nationalism and xenophobia, two larger forces at play, are also on the rise in the country. But to examine the scene a moment longer, we argue that moments like these, in which our programmatic efforts seem to fail, should matter as much as our successes do. We call for a glimpse into what contexts and forces produce such a moment, in which a writing fellow is questioned, disrupting what could have otherwise been a fruitful collaboration. Perhaps it's time to perceive WAC work in terms of programmatic trends and success rates, but also alongside events like these, shaped by the human interplay of human and non-human actors, influencing students and faculty through varying levels of scale and power. It is perhaps these events that contribute to the common knowledge that WAC programs tend to lack stability and sustainability. We take this line of logic from Puar, who configures such categories as race as not simple attributes of subjects, but rather as events co-opted and shaped by larger forces, such as neoliberalism. In this sense, what we're proposing that recognizing non-human agency also matters in WAC work and in our centers. However, such a recognition for us should never disavow feminist and queer of color critique germane to intersectional thinking. Instead, we believe it should operate as a way to understand better and locate marginalized bodies and queer disruptions within larger regimes, normality, and oppression, assembling on and assembled by our campuses and the processes that shape how we teach and mentor writers. John will take us through context from his institution.
Okay. So as, as we move toward the end of our talk here, I want to just give one more example of my work at the University of Wisconsin-Eau Claire. In my position as our director of our CWE, our Center for Writing Excellence, which again houses our writing center and our WAC work on this campus. Recently, I'm trying to offer, which is not a new idea, a faculty writing fellows program. We see this happening at other institutions across the US now, at the University of Oklahoma, Miami University. What the model does, among others, a faculty writing fellows approach, is it sort of flips the traditional, I would say, more traditional model of undergraduate, if I'm speaking from a writing center context, if I can for a moment here. You may have heard of writing fellows or embedded tutor programs where undergraduate students go into classrooms and work with faculty. Through a faculty fellows approach, rather, the faculty comes to the writing center or a WAC board group that you've assembled to work with you. It's really intensive. You're working with 1 or 2 faculty members a year to better understand and work with them to better understand how they think about writing, to share best practices in writing, and all of that. A couple years ago, I was able to get some funding from my institution to sort of do a trial run of this, and it worked out so well that I'm trying to launch a more formal program this upcoming fall. But I want to talk just briefly here about this sort of trial program that I did with the fellows model at UW-Eau Claire a couple of years ago. When I did that trial run, I opened the call to all faculty. Of course, my filtering process was admittedly influenced by best practices in writing studies and attuned to issues of power and injustice, such as those impacting students of color and international students. So I was not just looking for a diverse array of faculty to apply, and I was genuinely not trying to sort of pick multicultural faculty across disciplines or to tokenize in that way. As it turned out, though, my assistant director and I were ultimately okay, and our limit was to pick 2 faculty members from the same discipline, from languages. In both of these faculty members that applied for our Faculty Fellows program, they spoke in their application letters to how they see their writing pedagogies within their departments intersecting with wider relations of power that can silence marginalized bodies. Both faculty proposals to work with us in this program, they spoke to one another, forming a sort of what I saw as a relational energy that I was eager to accept and work within the program. And so over the course of the semester, my assistant director and I worked with these 2 faculty members around a common goal: to broaden the perspectives of all students with regard to language learning and cultural competency by creating opportunities for in-class and out-of-class interaction, using writing as a vehicle to do this. As the semester progressed, I witnessed a counter-assemblage, I would say, or coalitional team amongst these 2 faculty fellows members, myself and my assistant director. Again, a coalitional team invested in creating better writers and university networks for marginalized students, particularly international students. And as a result, the faculty participants began to expand their definition of writing instruction and the aims of their own pedagogies, and bringing those thoughts back to their departments. I think if you want to move on. So as we conclude here, to be sure, we do not doubt that a queer assemblage-driven approach to writing across the curriculum will still, that it won't still perpetuate institutional, capitalist, and even neoliberal paradigms. We think it's also worth questioning, as Karen Koppelson has, what fantasy we seek to fulfill in desiring to marry queer approaches with pedagogical and administrative projects. Though the answers we might provide to this question may seem well-intentioned, a queer assemblage model should draw our attention to the instability of forces, institutional and larger forces, that not only disrupt our best intentions, but are in fact fueled by our own supposedly human rights-based and otherwise liberationist approaches to writing pedagogy. Nevertheless, an assemblage model, we expect, might enable us to better adjust to the unstable play of forces impacting writing instruction and its scholarship, and to in turn better understand the queer disruptions that lurk beneath our programs, our campuses. And with that, we'll open up for questions. Thank you. Rachel. Oh, you're muted.
Sorry, those were my clapping hands.
Thank you.
So I'm just saying thank you. That was wonderful. No questions yet. I've got like a page of notes and I'm ruminating. But yeah, those were clapping. Yay.
Thank you. Sorry.
I have a question for you guys.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you for this presentation. I also really enjoyed your article in C's. Okay, so I have a question, but I'm not really sure exactly how I want to. I'm still working through my question, basically. So bear with me. And I haven't read Puar yet, even though I will. So apologies for my ignorance there. Okay, as a queer person, I love the idea of always already queer, because I feel that way about a lot of things, right? Just I look at the world through a queer lens because that's who I am, right? So I see a lot of things as always already queer, and I really enjoy that perspective about WAC work and other things. So I guess my question is like, how do you guys feel about WAC and other things being always already queer? Like the queerness is embedded in it and always has been, but then the queerness is also invisible to traits, right? Or to like sort of the standard view, right? So the queerness is there, but invisible, and or expected to be invisible. Like, for example, I'm very out at work and very out in my classroom and stuff, but the straights are surprised by that, right? Like if I'll say something like, oh, well, my students sometimes will make like offhanded homophobic comments, and then my colleague will be like, well, it's not like they know who you are. And I'm like, yes, they do. And my colleague is like, well, how? And I'm like, because I tell them. Right. Like my students know that I'm a lesbian. I tell them on day one, right? Because I want my students to orient, to know who they're talking to. You know what I mean? So like, what I guess what I'm saying is that it's expected that queerness be invisible. And I'm wondering how you think that that invisibility and the always already kind of intersect or overlap or contradict each other. Sorry, does this question make sense, you guys?
It does, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. I can jump in first. I mean, I thank you for your question, Tiffany. I think it's one that I've struggled with as well. I think it points to some complex questions around the body and how the body comes into classrooms too. Gosh, I mean, I struggled with it as well. I mean, I can really just I don't have an answer to it. But what I can say is that in working with students, I think one thing that can help here, or what that their article maybe provokes us to think about, is the fragility and the instability and the invisibility of history too. And so I think one thing that I see when in first year writing courses or in more explicitly queer courses that I teach is as the reverse, as I see some younger, if I don't mean that in an ageist way, but I do see some students today saying, well, things are not how they were in the 60s or 70s, right? Like we don't need these explicit conversations. It's just everything is already queer. It's all safe. We're all fine, right? But there's a tension, right? That lurks beneath that supposed safety, right? That folks feel on the student side and on the teacher side. And so I don't have an answer to that question. I don't think. I think I just complicated it more, but I appreciate the question.
Carrie, did you want to jump in, or I can also offer a response to Tiffany. Just I could say really quickly, yeah, that's a the invisibility piece is tricky. You know, I think I'm thinking back to like ways that get my previous campus was mostly very few people of color on the faculty, slightly more on staff. That same dynamic, similar dynamic with queer people. So very few queer faculty, a few more on staff. But just in terms of kind of, I'm thinking about like that invisibility and kind of my presence and my outness as a WAC director, and how that was expected to kind of not be a part of what I do, but like is, like you said, it's day one. You know, often I don't know that I necessarily would talk about like queer theory when I was training faculty colleagues, but you know, I might kind of bring up ideas about, you know, ways that faculty might orient themselves to writing when they're intaking student writing. So being mindful of, you know, mindful and accepting of they, them, or, you know, pluralities and things that kind of move beyond kind of, you know, like sort of traditional writing practices. You know, it's tricky though, because I think once I kind of made myself more outwardly out in my WAC administration, I would say that some of like my straight colleagues were sort of asking for my feedback, and there's that kind of embedded emotional labor in that. That I talked to a bunch of writing center directors through an empirical project about that very thing, like in what ways do our colleagues, students, tutors kind of invoke our bodies to be particular kinds of administrators in queer bodies. But yeah, I think it's a tricky one, but I would say that like, yeah, I found that kind of my outness even around my admin has, you know, sort of propelled forward, like inched forward the university culture, at least at my previous institution. Carrie, I didn't mean to like take over.
No, not at all. I mean, I think that my question is not well formed. Sorry, I can't turn on my camera. My internet.
No problem.
Trash garbage. But I think that one of the things that I'm always kind of curious about, I think particularly with institutional spaces and college spaces, which I've become more and more critical of, and also like, I think even this conference has been surreal in ways where like often like panels and sessions will be started with like, the world's on fire and climate change. Anyway, let's get back to work. And like, it's wild. But one of the things that I'm always interested in is the ways in which marginalized communities will do work on campus, and how that work will be taken up as a way of branding the campus. Right. And this is something I'm kind of particularly interested in right now because I teach at HSU, and we lost a bunch of students. We reached a peak of 10,000 enrollment, and then it went back. And so there's a real push to bring bodies here, even though there's like not the physical space. Like we had a pretty acute homelessness crisis when we had that much enrollment. Anyway, so I think all of this is like what I'm trying to get at, sorry, it's a lot, is that I guess I just wanted to express and hear your ideas about the ways like this particular kind of tension. And I think particularly within like WAC, how it seems like every time I engage in conversations about WAC, there's this sense of a kind of like on the horizon, we will be accepted and normalized. Just keep working, just keep waiting, and then people will see our work institutionally as valuable, and you'll get resources and it'll be lovely. And I don't know, I think that there's some utility about being also unseen, like of being in this kind of liminal position where people don't account for you, even though it also does mean fewer resources. I mean, I'm thinking about Jennifer Nash's recent book about the ways in which the term intersectionality has really been taken up into institutional spaces, right? And as a way of also like, this is maybe not the right word, but defanging it in theoretically. I mean, and her ultimate response is like, just keep producing more theory. Don't go back and create like a conflict about let's defend the actual meaning of intersectionality. So I don't know, I'm gonna trail off. I think I've said enough things and I don't know exactly what I'm saying. And invite for other comments.
Thank you, Carrie.
I can speak for a second about the utility of the unseen, Carrie. I thought that was a really powerful phrase. And I mean, it immediately takes me to Harry Denny's writing center work that talks about the subversive elements of writing centers, kind of that, the one-on-one pedagogy, but also, how writing centers can function in university cultures to kind of, in some ways, fly under the radar, but also, help propel forward certain kinds of social justice or access-oriented conversations. And I do think there's something to be said for that. Tying that back to what Tiffany said about just this tension between invisibility, but also, is there sometimes power in maybe not invisibility, but in that kind of under the radar, subversive kind of, I mean, as queer people, I think we're often doing that kind of work. I know that I am often, I might not run a WAC faculty workshop, like I said, with queer theory front and center in it, but often like what I'm doing is, hoping to sustain a culture of writing on campus that's, inclusive or progressive, or that allows students to be themselves or to make meaning through their writing. Sometimes those kinds of things, even to our colleagues, and I don't want to take that kind of colonialist approach, saying, okay, red comp people always know what's up, but sometimes even saying something like writing is multimodal is a very queer thing to talk about in a WAC workshop with faculty. That can be very subversive. That can also be very, fruitful for the institution. I hope I didn't kill it. Sorry, Carrie.
No, not at all. I appreciate this this has been my favorite panel, y'all.
Thank you. Thanks. Other questions?
Can you two talk a little bit about what you think is next? It seems like you might have like a bigger project coming or in mind.
Thanks, Michelle. Gosh, I'm being conscious of Trav's time. He's got a lot on his plate right now, but we need to chat. No, I think God, I don't have an answer to that, but and Trav and I will continue to talk about how to continue this work. But personally, I think I appreciate the question, because I don't know what this project has pushed me to think about. And I think maybe this builds off of Carrie's question about, I mean, I've spent a lot of time thinking about sort of larger, together, Trav and I both have, thinking about, what we all, as others in this room, have thought about larger larger work that we can create in terms of institutional change. And I think our project kind of speaks to what a WAC program can do to change an institution. I don't know, maybe I'm just getting older, but the more I'm in this, the more I seem to kind of go back to these sort of like foundational kind of organic writing center values that have always fueled my WAC work, which is like the sort of one-to-one human, talking to people, empathizing, getting beyond ourselves, seeing, you know, just one great thing happen at an institution, just two people coming together to do something, I think is just people are yearning for that right now. They're wanting that. They're wanting that more than institutions saying we've got it all figured out or here's how we're going to do it, right? I don't know if that's kind of where my head's at.
Michelle, I think I want to kind of live this out. I feel like even writing this was a really beautiful process with John. We had some thoughts. We wanted to get them down. We were lucky enough to have somebody want to see this go out into circulation. I think for me, a lot of these ideas link back to one of my first jobs as a writing center director. And I saw in some ways, as we were working through the proofs of this article, like long after it was written and we're approving copy edits, I was thinking about how much in sort of conflict this article was with like my last WAC job and how I didn't really feel like I was doing queer WAC. I felt like I was doing a lot of the things we describe as, more like kind of checklisting syllabi, doing my best that I could. But I think at my forthcoming position, I want to think about what WAC looks like there, what queer WAC will look like there. I know very little actually on the ground of the culture. So I think for me, that's the next step.
Looks like we might have time for about one more question, if anybody wants to. Okay. Tiffany.
I do have one more. It's kind of a basic question, and this is probably because I haven't read Puar yet, but you mentioned, Jonathan, you mentioned counter assemblage at the end of your presentation, and I was wondering if you could just quickly clarify what a counter assemblage is exactly. I'm not sure if I'm totally clear on what you mean by that.
Yeah, I think, yeah, if and Trev, jump in here if you want, but I see it as sort of, if there's all these forces, right? If we're perceiving these sort of, in some ways, messed up conglomeration of forces, the world is on fire around us, right? A counter assemblage being how can you assemble some forces or ideas, right? And by forces, I mean like bodies, like people coming together or ideas or theories or what have you to work against that, right? So like the faculty fellows, like sort of pilot program that I did, I would see as like, just like 4 bodies coming together in our conversations as being a counter assemblage against that. Yeah.
I think we're just about out of time. If it's,
go ahead, Jeff.
I was just going to say, if just a reminder that the slides, the transcript, and the article are all linked on the portal for this presentation if they're of interest. And I'll put my email in here in case I know it was on the slides, but just in case you want to more copy and paste ready. Thanks so much for coming, y'all. It was fantastic to have such a great group of people today. So thank you.
Thank you all. Enjoy the conference.